My name is Leanne Wolf, and I am the Associate Director of the Northern Plains Ethics Institute, and I'm delighted to have you all here, and I'm particularly delighted to have our panel here. I am given the pleasure of introducing our facilitator, our moderator for this session. Karen Ahrens is a health, nutrition, and food consultant and advocate. She is a registered dietitian practicing in public health. Karen serves as the coordinator for creating a Hunger-Free North Dakota coalition and seeks greater understanding of food systems as a volunteer board member of a local farmers market and a new statewide Local Foods Development Alliance. She and her husband, Dwayne, a chef, teach cooking classes together featuring local foods and how to eat more like a Mediterranean on the prairie. Karen engages in policy by drafting legislation and serving as a member of a Farm Bill work group for the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. Please join me in welcoming Karen. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you all for being here today. Thank you to the Northern Plains Ethics Institute for bringing us together. It is my honor to be part of this panel. And thank you to all who came today to listen and learn. And also please be thinking of some questions that you might want to ask of our panelists, because there will be time for that at the end. I want to start out with an acknowledgement. And please forgive me if my pronunciation isn't quite right. We acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the Nueta, Hidatsa, Sanish, and Lakota Dakota people. The state of North Dakota is home to the Nueta, Hidatsa, Arikwa, Dakota, Lakota, and Anishinaabe Ojibwe people. It's through removal, relocation, forced assimilation, unkept treaty obligations, and other policies of the United States and the North Dakota government that the health and lives of Indigenous people have been harmed. But let us work together in a good way to undo this harm. And I'd like to introduce who is next to me at the table. I'm very pleased to be here with Dr. Donald Warren, who is a medical doctor, MD, and Master of Public Health, MPH. He's the Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, as well as the Director of Indians into Medicine, the InMed program, and Master of Public Health programs, and Professor of Family and Community Medicine at the School of Medicine and Health Sciences at the University of North Dakota. He also serves as a Senior Policy Advisor to the Great Plains Tribal Chairman's Health Board in Rapid City, South Dakota. Dr. Warren is a member of the Oglala Lakota tribe from Pine Ridge, South Dakota, and comes from a long line of traditional healers and medicine men. He received his MD from Stanford University School of Medicine and his MPH from the Harvard School of Public Health. His work experience includes several years as a primary care physician with the Gila River Health Care Corporation in Arizona, staff clinician with the National Institutes of Health, Indian Legal Program faculty with the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at at Arizona State University, Health Policy Director for Intertribal Council of Arizona, Executive Director of the Great Plains Tribal Chairman's Health Board, and Chair of the Department of Public Health at North Dakota State University. He serves as a member of the National Board of Trustees for the March of Dimes, Health Disparities Subcommittee of the Advisory Committee to the Director for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, otherwise known as the CDC, and he's a member of the Board of Directors of the Public Health Foundation. So please welcome Dr. Warren. Joining us this morning also is Dr. Jessica Whiteplume. Dr. Whiteplume is Oglala Lakota also. Her Lakota name is Shung Agli Win, which means she brings back horses. She grew up also on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. Jessica went on to complete her PhD in clinical psychology from the University of North Dakota, as well as a master's in public health from the University of Minnesota. Her doctoral internship was at the University of Florida Shands Hospital, where she completed a behavioral health specialty. Jessica's home is a family ranch on the Fort Berthold Reservation in North Dakota. In recent years, Jessica has led a culturally based wellness program for the MHA Nation and served as the Director of Social Sciences as well as the Agriculture Department Director for the Noita Edatsa Sanish College. She is currently the Director of Wellness and Sustainability for the MHA Nation Twin Buttes South Segment, where her work includes programs such as Indigenous food sovereignty, buffalo, honeybees, horse programs, and sustainable, culturally grounded housing. She also serves as a consultant on a variety of Indigenous wellness efforts. Jessica lives near Twin Buttes with her husband Marty Youngbear, their children, and the family horses, dogs, cats, and chickens. Please welcome Jessica. Our topic today is about food deserts. What is a food desert? You might ask. Many of you in the audience are familiar with that. But broadly, it's a place where people don't have ready, easy access to foods for enough food every day for a healthy and active lifestyle. The United States Department of Agriculture has an official definition, and they have come to this definition with between the USDA, the Department of Treasury, and the Department of Health and Human Services, so that it can be measured and located. So we can look at these maps and find out where the hot spots are, where the issues are, where people have to go more than a short ways to reach access to food. Within that system, a food desert is recognized as having access to a grocery store. But we also know over the last 6 years, we've been studying the number of grocery stores in North Dakota as well. And we know that in the last 6 years in North Dakota, we've lost 20% of our grocery stores in small towns of fewer than 2,100 people. So to our whole state, which over 90% of the land is used to grow things or crops or cattle, that we have places where people find it hard to access food. These food desert measurements don't take into account, however, that people may be growing their own food, canning their own food, foraging for food, hunting for food. So those kind of activities aren't included in a food desert map, but we acknowledge that there are many people, although in some cases a very diminishing number of people who engage in those, but with the efforts of people, small groups of committed people working to increase people's access to food through gardening, through growing your own food and finding your own food and becoming self-sufficient in that way. So the first question to our panelists is to describe the food access where you come from or where you live now. And I think Dr. Warren has actually some pictures to help us understand that.
Yeah. And thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this important discussion. And again, I'm Dr. Donald Warren, and I teach a lot of classes, so I'm accustomed to using PowerPoint slides, so you'll have to forgive me. But I think it's important to Dakota people, and they are to the north. The Assiniboine is another renaming of the Nakota people. So in Grand Forks, that's actually a homeland for Dakota, but it's also a gathering point for my people traditionally. And the reason it was called the Dakota Territory is because colonization came from the east. So they encountered the Dakotas first. That's why it became the Dakota Territory. If colonization had come from the west, this would be the Lakota Territory. We'd be in North Lakota instead of North Dakota. I'd work at UNL instead of UND, but that's how it kind of works out. So in thinking about this area in Grand Forks, and I get asked the question in national settings, why do you work at University of North Dakota? And it's because it's my homeland. It's a gathering point for our people. And we use the riverways for transportation, long before we had highways. So we depended on the rivers for transportation, but also as food sources. Obviously the animals were along the rivers, and we could grow gardens and crops along the rivers as well. And I currently live on the East Grand Forks side, and every time I go over the bridge, I imagine what that must have looked like in Grand Forks with 1,000 teepees, with 10,000 people, and how beautiful that must have been, for the last several thousand years. And this really is our homeland in the Dakotas. And as I had mentioned, we really use the waterways as our source of food, but also source of transportation and as gathering points. So we would have Grand Forks as a gathering point, the Red Lake River heading west and the Red River heading north. Later in the summer, we'd also meet our 7 council fires, which includes the Dakota as well, and what's now called the Forks in Winnipeg, if you've ever been there. But that was a gathering point for our people. So it's fascinating to me. Most people don't really know why it's called North Dakota. But out of curiosity, how many people know what Minnesota means? Most people don't, actually. It's usually right around 0 who actually know what Minnesota means, but it's actually 2 Dakota words. Mini means water, so you may have heard of Miniwichoni, which means water is life. So Shota means cloudy or smoky. So a Mini Shota is literally this time of year when the weather changes and it appears that the clouds are rising off of the water. That's a Mini Shota. So that whole area with all the waterways and lakes was known as the land of the Mini Shota. Now it's all Minnesota, right? So every time you say Minneapolis, pat yourself on the back because you're being bilingual, but in this case, Dakota and Greek. So Mini is water and polis is Greek for city. So it's water, city, and Dakota Greek. So you're being bilingual every time you say Minneapolis. Probably didn't even realize that. But where I'm from is in Kyle, South Dakota, very close to Jessica's hometown as well. And the original name of Kyle is medicine root, or Trijutahaka, which means medicine root in Lakota. And it's an area where we have a lot of traditional healers and medicine men and rich connection to culture, but a lot of poverty. And I think it's important not just to talk about it in theory, but to even have a good imagery of some of our challenges. There is a cafe there. It's actually closed down just in the recent years. But I think what they learned at this particular cafe is that you can bread and deep fry just about anything and serve it for lunch. We really did not have access to healthy food, unfortunately. So it has to be food that can be stored for a long period of time, so things that can be in a freezer and then put into a deep fryer, or things that can be in a can or in a bag and stored for long periods of time. So very minimal access to healthy food. Across from the cafe is the gas station that does double as a grocery store, but you can imagine the type of food that's available. In addition to the concept of a food desert, there's also a concept in public health called a poverty tax. And it's not really a tax where the government collects a percentage of money, but people who live in these communities have to pay more money for fresh fruits and vegetables. So it's even more expensive to buy healthy foods because they're perishable and we're not doing a good job with local cultivation of those foods. So I think that's an important part of our discussion. And we also have to recognize it's not just a theoretical concept related to ethics. It's not just a theoretical concept related to economies. There are real outcomes of this and a lot of human suffering. We have among the highest rates of type 2 diabetes in the world among our tribes right here in the Dakotas. This is a picture of one of my uncles, and he unfortunately has an amputation because of poorly controlled diabetes. And when you live in a food desert and you're living within poverty and you don't have access to things that can keep us healthy, what we wind up seeing is a lot of human suffering that's unnecessary. So an important part of this discussion from an ethical perspective is identifying solutions, not just identifying the challenges and the problems. And I just wanted to close this initial part talking about traditional perspectives. In Lakota, we did not have a written language. So we learn through stories and an oral history about culture and life lessons. And in this region, there's a story of 3 sisters walking along a river. And as they're walking along the river, they see babies and young children in the water struggling to stay afloat. So the first sister says, "This is an emergency. It's a crisis. We need to get the babies out of the water right now." And the second sister thinks about that and says, no, we need to teach them how to swim so they can survive while they are in the water. And the third sister keeps walking upstream, and the other two get angry with her and say, where are you going? Why aren't you helping us? And she says, I'm going to find out who's putting these babies in the water, and I'm going to stop them. And that's public health. That is literally working further upstream. So when we look at our challenges related to lack of access to healthy food, we also have to look upstream. What are the social determinants that cause food deserts? What are the social policy issues that result in marginalization of some populations and subsequent health disparities? But even more importantly, what are the solutions? So I just wanted to start with a few pictures. I think it's important to have visual images of it, not just think about it in theory, but that's where I'm from, and I'd love to hear from Jessica.
Well, I just, I'm so honored to be here, to have been invited also. I'm really glad to see all of you here. So happy to be on this panel. Any chance that I get to hang out and work with Dawn is such a pleasure. And it just makes me feel encouraged because we're like at the cutting edge of this generation of work and progress. And I do really believe that we're at a great moment in history right now. Just taking a quick step back, I think that, well, yeah, let's talk about where we're from, because conveniently we're really close to from the same place. When we first met, it was kind of like, wow, how awesome is this? Because our little respective towns, if you can even call them that, I would literally ride to Kyle on my horse, when I was a kid, and visit some people and then ride back, and so we share that history of knowing just how deep and beautiful and amazing it is to grow up on the reservation with those traditions on the land, and just how beautiful and strengthening that is, but also how difficult it is. Like, we have no misgivings about the poverty and things that are really difficult, but they are a consequence. They didn't just happen because we're natives and, here we are. Though they are a consequence of, like you said, social determinants. But yeah, I am from this area too, and I love, can you all hear me okay? Oh, good. I love to see the pictures because it reminds me of, I guess, the wisdoms that help us now. We're now up there in the academic world, but it really helps to know where you come from. And I really just encourage that for everyone. I love a quote from, I heard recently that said, everyone is indigenous to somewhere. Rowan White said that. So sometimes it's like, wow, these indigenous people, you got such rich traditions, but really everyone is indigenous to somewhere. And whatever that is, it's deep in your genetics. It's going to offer you wisdom. And so I just encourage everyone to go on that journey and let it influence your work and your life. So, yeah, so I am from Manderson, actually. I say Pine Ridge because most people don't distinguish, but Manderson is right close to Kyle. It is a very poor area, but very complex. I'd also like to say that I think right now we're really blessed to be even having a conversation within North Dakota Ethics Institute. It tends to be, kind of conservative state, and not to get political or anything, but that we even have an institute to talk about ethics and that we're all here having these discussions, I think is amazing. The fact that food deserts have even been labeled and identified, that's probably, the past 10 years? That's pretty amazing, because it used to just be like, well, make the right choices, and this concept of American individuality, and if you make the bad choices, that's, you're gonna suffer the consequences. But now we're recognizing the more public health approach to disparities, and so I feel really like we're in a good place to start those discussions, and I'm real grateful to be a part of it. What was the second part of your question, Karen?
Or where you come from and or where you live now.
Okay, yes.
Food access.
Right, so right now I guess I don't look at the picture, I can turn to you all. Right now I'm in Twin Buttes, North Dakota. I took a nice long loop around. Like I said, I went to college, a few different colleges, went to the bigger universities, and I just loved college. I loved school. I was a professional student and met some great people. Went to, I mentioned UF Shands because it's a pretty large, prestigious, if you will, pretty serious medical training hospital, and it was amazing experiences. And I came back to North Dakota, to Grand Forks, to do my postdoc, and was called on by my mentor at the time to really ask ourselves, well, what do you feel like needs to be done? What do you feel like is going to make a difference? And the world was my oyster, and I really came back to my life on the reservation, and how in my family we happened to be horse people. And so we had young men and women walking 3 miles to our place, and we would run in these hills on these horses, and we were, I could just still remember it clear as day. We were proud, we were laughing, we were strong, we were talented, and beautiful. Like, nothing about that picture of us is these super high-risk kids and poor, desolate Shannon County, South Dakota. And so I realized that I had to go on a journey to start making this connection between those things that I saw that were healthy, and they were maybe cultural and totally outside of my training or education, but I could see that it was health. There are parts of our community that were clearly promoting health and advancing health, and people who were actually even doing interventions, but they were never called that. They were never called a program. And so that's kind of been my journey, is to pull those pieces together in sometimes odd ways. I might be the only clinical psychology PhD who ran an ag department, but the way we think about health is, of course, the plants are your whole concept of health can't be separated from the land and the animals and the plants and the farmers markets. And the more we separate them, we're not helping ourselves, So, and it was easy. It sounds funny, but the ag, USDA and everyone in that field was like, of course, let's do horse therapy, yes. And everybody in mental health is like, yes, let's go to the gardens and do our work, and let's do horse therapy, So it's really a welcoming environment that I have experienced. Right now, I'm in Twin Buttes. I work for Councilman Spotted Bear at the MHA Nation. So it's kind of full circle. I'm back in a teeny tiny little community on the reservation. We're the most rural on MHA. It takes us 2 hours to even get to Newtown, which is the center of the reservation, or the hub, so to speak. And we like it that way. We love being way, way out there. We have horses again. Our kids are running around the hills on horses. So we're very, very happy there. But I'm, again, on the ground as far as it's a food desert. And access is really limited to healthy foods. We just opened a gas station, and people are excited about that. And we're, wedging in some salads, no pun intended, but it is still a food desert, and our kids are still not thinking of food as medicine. That's how we think of it. And not just natives, but people who really work in nutrition and holistic health. Your food is what you are. It feeds your spirit. And I think most people don't think of it that way. And so we're working on that in a lot of ways in our community, and we have some maybe somewhat unique philosophies on it, but also history as it pertains to our tribal people. But I think it's a challenge that we're all working on. Well, at least in the United States. So.
Thank you. So we've heard that we are nurtured by food and connected through food, that food comes from the land. How is it that we've arrived at this point where there are so many disconnections from the land and from each other? And whereas food is medicine, there are physical and behavioral health implications of these disconnections and our current food situation. So I'd like to ask Dr. Warren to talk a little bit about what are those physical health implications of this disconnection from land and food and each other.
Well, of course, when we look at disconnection from land, we don't have the same territory and access that we used to, and we don't have the free roaming buffalo herds that we used to as well. So our food systems have been disrupted tremendously, and much of that was intentional, some of it just the outcome of colonization and then moving on to reservations. So just as an example, where we're from in Pine Ridge, we never lived actually on the plains. In the winter, we went into the hills. We were smart enough to avoid the blizzards, but now we're on reservations where we don't have the access to foods where the food goes. So we obviously closely connected to the earth because that's where the food comes from, but also closely connected to the animals, and particularly buffalo. And for buffalo is an incredibly great source of protein, and the nutritional profile at NDSU, they have meat science laboratories, and they look at the nutritional profiles of various types of meat, and the nutrition based in buffalo is much better than what you get in store-bought beef. But also the connectivity is even deeper than just the nutritional components. There's also a deeply rooted spiritual component to this. Every time we eat meat, we have to recognize that an animal sacrificed its life so we could eat. And we're so disconnected from that in modern times. If we think about going to the grocery store and purchasing steaks, they're nicely wrapped in this clear plastic and it's very sanitary, very clean. We never had to see that animal die. We never had to cut it open. We never had to see the blood. We never had to recognize that it had a family. We're so disconnected from the spirit of our food. I think that really changes our perspective on the value of food and how we should be grateful for it and be respectful of the fact that this living creature sacrificed its life so we could feed our family. That's a deeply rooted spiritual concept, and we're totally disconnected from that in modern times. So in my own family, we're very fortunate in that we have resources. So every year I do go hunt a buffalo. So we have a freezer full of buffalo meat every year, but my children understand the value of that, and they cry. They recognize, we sacrifice an older bull for food, but that bull had a family, that bull had children. So they're very respectful of the whole idea, even when we have, buffalo spaghetti sauce. They're cognizant of the fact that an animal died in order to feed them and keep them healthy. And that's a powerful and meaningful thing. And I think we've just lost sight of the meaning of that. We've lost sight of the meaning of food from that perspective. And then even just growing the food and recognizing food as medicine. It's really fascinating. We have a lot of medicines that we use now that have been used for thousands of years by the tribes. How many people know where aspirin comes from? Just out of curiosity. A couple people do. So it's from the bark of the willow tree. So we would have willow tea frequently, that basically harvesting the willow bark in a traditional and sustainable way and then creating a tea with it was good for pain management, aches and pains, and that's basically aspirin. So we had been using aspirin for thousands of years until Bayer discovered it, right? Now someone else took credit for it. And just fascinating when I think about this, in science, we can assess the components of willow bark, and they'll boil it and they'll call it an aqueous solution. We just call it tea, basically is what it is. So there's many examples where the food is, if it's healthy and has good nutritional profile, obviously it's promoting health. And we think of medicine not just as treating a disease, but promoting health. And healthy foods, diverse food systems are incredibly valuable. But I feel like we've lost sight of what that really means when we have meat from an animal, or even the nutritional value of the types of foods that we would have. And again, it's also connected to the waterways and to the land. Water is life, quite literally. And we've been able to live really outside the natural world with piping water in, to deserts, for example, artificially, but living outside the laws of nature in many ways. And then even damming rivers changes the natural ecology. So we've done a lot of changes to the earth, and that has a direct impact on access to food. And maybe in a little bit we can also talk about some of the commodity food programs as well, but I'd love to hear Jessica's perspective.
Thank you. So I just made a note. He mentioned that we don't think of medicine as just medication for an illness, and I think that's just worth exploring or explaining a little more, because when I say medicine to Don, he and I would have the same understanding, but it's probably, might be a little different, so I'll just talk about that. When a native person says that, this water has medicine, or even, a horse has medicine, we don't mean it's treating an illness. We mean it has a special power, a special energy, special spirit, if you will, that can provide you with strength or wisdom, and that can help you, again, realign with the world of nature, the laws of nature, kind of where you're supposed to be in harmony with things. And I know that sounds a little bit, vague, but really I think medicine supports that. When things are in balance and in harmony is when you're healthy. And that the more we are disconnected from our natural ways of being, it harms us physically. So when we say medicine, it's a little bit broader and maybe more inclusive and more holistic. So I just had a quick note about that. And so, but to follow up on we're talking about the physical consequences and mental consequences of food deserts. Gosh, yeah, I think there's lots of documentation on the physical consequences of food deserts. For just to be a few concrete examples, we're probably a lot of us on the same page, but just a few examples, we're fairly health conscious. I really find fiber to be important for my kids, for everybody. We all need fiber, I don't want them to eat so much sugar, so I try to have a lot of fruits and veggies in our house. Well, we have to drive really 2 hours to get good fruits and veggies, if not, an hour to get some that are probably going to be bad by tomorrow morning, So, I'm literally like, okay, well, I got a busy day, we got a game, we got cross country, only have 2 hours in the evening, but I got to drive, however long to get some fruits for my kids. And it's a real choice we have to make every day. So it's a larger sacrifice to try to have healthy food. And that's everyone in our community, and that's, with someone who's, we have a decent income, we have a good car, we have consciousness about food. So other people are not even that far along. So I might have food or fresh fruit 3 or 4 days out of the week. My neighbors might not have them at all, once in a while, and it's not because they don't like fruits and vegetables. We're also, speaking of mental health, we're creatures of habit. So if you have had fried foods your whole life and suddenly someone hands you a salad, it's not going to seem too appealing, Whereas if you've been raised on having a balanced diet your whole life, you see some greens and you're like, oh yes, that sounds good, I crave that. It's just a basic, kind of psychological pattern that happens. I remember distinctly, I was in Grand Forks, so I must have been in graduate school. Yeah, I had already completed a bachelor's degree, a 4-year degree, and I was in graduate school when I first had a spinach salad. My other colleague in graduate school, who come from Minnesota, from a well-to-do family, she's like, well, yeah, we eat spinach salads all the time. And I was like, this is incredible. Why did no one tell me about this before? I just literally knew spinach from Popeye references. I didn't even watch Popeye. But, that's the truth of the matter. Indian children generally are not going to be eating spinach salads, no matter how much they care about their children. So that's just the basic fact of access. As far as now we're getting to solutions. I don't like to really go too far down the path where we just feel sad and guilty and depressed. So I'm really looking forward to talking about solutions, but we do need to understand, where things are right now. As far as mental health, did you want me to go ahead and jump into that part? I was trying to, there's some obvious direct things as far as, children's focus and nutritious foods and the direct mental health benefits of healthy foods. Obviously, what he's talking about when you engage in where your food comes from with your family, that's something that's going to benefit your mental health. But really, the honest truth is you have to take that step back as far as the determinants. The mental health status on average on reservations, there's a lot more mental health issues. There's higher rates of suicide, higher rates of depression, anxiety, those things. And the determinants of that are very similar to the determinants of the food deserts. So we're talking about a lot of historical trauma. We're talking about, our parents who didn't have the basic training on how to be parents because of the boarding schools. So my dad, his parents were in the boarding schools, and then he was orphaned. So our family, it's been a real journey. I just had this fun joke with my brother about how he, was much more of a fighter when we were young, and now we're all learning how to love better. But that's the truth of the matter, is that when we were kids, our parents didn't know how to parent. So we're kind of going through this change in our own healing of where now he and I, my brother, he has a garden. It's an amazing garden, But earlier in our lives, we were just barely surviving, and we were struggling with mental health issues that were related to our circumstances, But as we're evolving, now we have a chance to think about nutrition. We're thinking about our children's fiber intake, But as a community, and that's happening a lot more, we're actually really a pretty good ways on our healing and growing. But still, there are a lot who are having to work through trauma. Therefore, their mental health, they're not even thinking about nutrition. They're thinking about day-to-day surviving, struggling on how to deal with their emotions, their families. Frankly, nutrition might not even be on their radar. Sometimes it's getting there, and then it's a chance for us to talk about it with friends, with family. But a lot of those other historical issues have to be addressed before we can even be at a consciousness of, how are we treating our bodies, and how are we looking to the future? You have to be at a certain place of comfort to have that mindset, if that makes sense. So, let you go ahead.
Just thinking about, from the psychology arena, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and if your basic needs are not being met, you're probably not going to be concerned about growing a garden. You actually have to have basic needs met before you can think in those terms. But it is so valuable, and for those of us who do have the resources. And at our house, we do have a garden, and our daughter is just really taking it up and just loves it. And she's now 9 years old, but when she was 4, we let her plant her own kale. And I'd never heard she'd turned 5, and then a 5-year-old saying, "Mommy, can I have more kale?" It's really remarkable because it's her kale, So when we order kale, it's it's not as good as Anna's kale, but she'll order it anyway. But she grew up with it. That's normal. And I think that's how we all grew up historically before we lost access to the territory and the resources we needed for local food systems. And what that's been replaced with, in many ways, is commodity food systems. And how many people know about the commodity food program? Okay, good, almost everybody. With the commodity food program through the United States Department of Agriculture, it's a food distribution program for impoverished populations, and there's a separate FDPIR, Food Distribution Program on Indian Reservations, that most of us grew up with. And they've made a lot of improvements over the last decade or so, but when I was growing up, it was very unhealthy food. So, just the bleached flour, white sugar, white bread, some sort of spam-like meat product, not exactly sure what that was. Grape juice, which I think was just sugar water with purple food coloring. I remember my siblings and cousins, we all had that kind of Kool-Aid smile from the plastic cups of that purple sugar water, whatever it was. And that's what we grew up with. And it's really fascinating. Now when we think of traditional foods, a lot of people think of fry bread. Even when I go home now, if it's a ceremony or a feast, there's an expectation that there will be fry bread. I was like, why? Because it's traditional. I was like, well, actually, no, it's not. It's not traditional American Indian food. We never fried dough. It's actually the people doing the best they can with their commodities. So if we want to call it traditional, that's fine. It's traditional USDA food. It's not traditional American Indian food, right? But in truth, it's prepackaged diabetes is what it is. When you think about fry bread, with the enriched flour, that's probably the biggest false advertisement in nutritional history to say enriched flour, because all the nutrition's taken out and all that's left behind is the starch. And then you combine it with shortening, which is saturated, hydrogenated vegetable oil, which is incredibly unhealthy. It's like the worst type of carbohydrate, the worst type of fat, put it together and we call it traditional food, which is really unfortunate. So with fry bread, it really is a source of disease. It really is a poison. And I think one of our big challenges, internally with the tribes, whether it's from a bioethical perspective or a cultural perspective, we really need to look at that. We call it traditional. We serve it at our ceremonies, but it's actually poison. That's colonization making its way even into our ceremonies. We really need to think about that. We need to address it. And I talk about this with my family. They get mad at me, because everybody loves their fry bread. But all I'm saying is the truth. This is the truth. This is poison. It's killing our people. It's not indigenous, but we're calling it traditional. So we have a lot of work to do on that front. And again, I'll take all the flaming arrows, by criticizing fry bread, but it's not our way. And it's been colonized and imposed upon us, and we're killing ourselves by accepting this food. We don't have to do that. And then another program that has made improvements in recent years is the WIC program, Women, Infants, and Children. And when I was working as a full-time clinician in Arizona, the WIC program was basically a baby formula distribution program. They're just handing out baby formula. And when you think about the culture of poverty, if you have a young woman, a young mom, and she's never had nice things because of poverty, and you're offering her formula, which is relatively expensive, and giving it to her for free, is she going to use it? Well, of course. So one of the unintended outcomes of WIC is that we started to see impoverished populations have higher rates of formula feeding than more affluent populations. And formula feeding is directly associated with diabetes. If you take the population of formula-fed versus breastfed babies, as adults, the formula-fed babies have higher rates of diabetes, higher rates of death. So it's poison. And it's called formula for a reason. Does that sound appealing to anyone? Come on over, we'll have a glass of formula. It's just, it's chemicals, right? But this is what we feed our infants. And I do have an image, maybe I'll show it in a little bit, but our commodity corn syrup, pure corn syrup, on the label it says use in your baby formula. Yeah, so we're just poisoning our families with government-sponsored food programs that are a direct result of colonization, marginalization, and poverty. And that's the upstream work that we need to do, is to get rid of the policies that are leading to more poisoning of our people. And I would put forth that many of the USDA programs are at the root of that.
Yeah, interestingly enough, just last week at the Native American Nutrition Conference in Minnesota, the sous chef, Sean Sherman, was talking about, and for the past 2 or 3 years or so, the USDA has been attempting to hear these words and make improvements when it comes to offering commodity foods through its different programs. And so things like wild rice and bison had been made available to tribes across the United States. But just last week, learning an unintended consequence of this was that because of USDA making large purchases of these indigenous foods from one area of the country, in that area where they were purchasing it and spreading it across to other tribal people in the United States, the cost to the people living in the areas where it was grown or raised has increased, making it unaffordable for some elders or seniors living in that area. So that.
Yeah, and that's another kind of unintended consequence. And I applaud the idea of trying to incorporate more traditional foods, but I think there's such a need and a role for locally cultivated foods. And historically, of course, we had different types of access to territory and to food, including, hunting grounds where we would be able to dry buffalo. And actually, if you mix shredded dried buffalo with choke cherries, it's incredible. It's called wasna. It's an incredibly tasty food. But you could store that for long periods of time. We don't have the same access to either chokecherries or buffalo that we used to. But we have newer technologies. I see some communities now using greenhouses, and trying to use more technology to create more locally cultivated foods, because that is one of the unintended consequences. Is if you're harvesting, for example, wild rice from Minnesota, then the cost of wild rice to the local people goes up, less access. You're benefiting other people, but it would be better to focus on locally cultivated opportunities, I would think.
Yeah, and Jessica, do you want to share just a little bit about, I think we'll start moving into solutions. And so the current tribal chair of the MHA Nation is offering this very large vision of more locally cultivated foods in a very big way.
Mm-hmm. He is very committed, and really there's just so much happening right now. It's pretty amazing when you get out there as far as the movements towards more indigenous foods and locally grown foods and gardening. There's just examples everywhere. At MHA Nation, Chairman Fox is very committed. I would speak specifically to Councilman Spotted Bear, who is my boss and also my brother. And, he has said, he's a very cultural person. He's a spiritual person. He's a sun dancer. We have all this oil at MHA. It's a big deal, another panel. But he has specifically said, because those values are not always aligned, but he has specifically said, we're going to take this flash of money and call it an opportunity, and we're going to flip the script and create and invest all into sustainable energy, into our own food systems. And so we have a Department of Wellness and Sustainability. One of our very first programs was a buffalo program. So we started out with 14. The first year we worked with the Intertribal Buffalo Council. They are a pretty long-standing organization. They're a great group to know about and to just be aware of. They work with tribes all across the country and with national parks who sometimes have surplus buffalo. So the parks will send the buffalo or work with ITBC to then disperse surplus buffalo to the tribal reservations. And so we've been working with them. As of last week, we were awarded 30 more, so now we'll have 100 buffalo just in Twin Buttes. And we, that just makes us so happy. Again, they have a medicine that is direct through the healthy food and the meat nutrition, but they also have, like a spiritual medicine. Every time we drive into Twin Buttes, all the kids, they go, they go, by the buffalo, and they acknowledge them and that they're our close relatives again. And so we feel like, nutritionally, spiritually, even economically, that's going to be a real business for our community as well. So that's a huge initiative. We have, I can't help but launch into the honeybees. We were just saying, that sometimes locally cultivated food is part of your growing culture, because honey is not necessarily a traditional Dakota food, though maybe it might have been. We might have had honey. I don't know, maybe. But we now have a honeybee program in Twin Buttes, so we have our own 1 year of mentorship, and now we're up to like 12 hives, and literally last week I was covered in honey the whole time because it was warm and we have to work while it's warm, and we love it. It's, again, it's nutritionally beneficial in many ways. You can use it on antiseptic, on wounds. We're giving it for free to the elders, and it gets them to think about, sweeteners in a different way. I don't have the details on honey versus sugar. Don might have a little more, but I'd like to imagine that it is better than white sugar. I'm quite sure it is, actually. Can't tell you the glucose spike, patterns, but it gets them thinking about, hey, this food came here from right down the hill. I can see where this food came from, and I'm proud of that. And I'm thinking, as I spoon it into my tea, where that came from. And so that's a real shift in mentality versus the, sterile packaged stuff you might get at the store. Similarly, we have a large community garden, which we're fighting the thistle and local little critters. We're feeding, I think, maybe more wildlife than we are people, but it's a process. We also have a giant, really giant, my colleague and I laugh about our grand visions. We have a really, like a 4-acre orchard, fruit orchard. About half of it is June berries that are just planted. This is their second year, so they're still babies. But June berries were traditionally here, and for the Mandan Hidatsas specifically, a real staple food. We know now that it's a superfood as far as nutrition. They're kind of related to blueberries, but very high antioxidants, very healthy food, used in ceremonies. And so that was another initiative that Corey really wanted to move forward, is the Juneberry orchard. We are opening, again, I actually did horse programs for many years, and then I had focused on this other stuff, but now we're opening a whole equestrian center again, which is gonna have horse therapy programs, but also Indian relay racing and all, rodeo, all that good stuff, which just sounds like fun and competition, but it's all that and more. It's also, again, connecting with that which makes us strong and powerful and admired. We were the masters of the plains. Can you imagine the skill it takes to run on a horse bareback, no saddle, with a bow and arrow and a buffalo that's this big and faster than you, and shooting up along that's skill, like beyond Olympic level skill. And we have that still. And when you, I think, reconnect with your strengths as a people, broadly speaking, again, it just raises your level of healing and consciousness to, it at the same time encourages what are we eating? What are we feeding our horses? All those discussions are tied together, really, if that makes sense.
So just think about things in terms of solutions. We really have to understand the social determinants of nutritional health or nutritional-based disease. And for those who are interested, one of my colleagues at UND and I published an article called Social Determinants of American Indian Nutritional Health, and it's in the Current Developments in Nutrition is the journal that it's in. But when I think about the social determinants and why is it that we're facing some of these challenges? Of course, loss of land, loss of territory, loss of buffalo, loss of cultural ways, loss of some traditional knowledge as well. There's all kinds of factors that lead to the nutritional health disparities and food deserts. But there are some meaningful solutions to consider. Some areas that we've seen other tribes work effectively. One is to improve local food systems. So whether it's WIC program, we now see WIC doing a much better job of promoting breastfeeding and educating as to why that's important for the nutritional health of children. So those existing programs, also looking at school lunch and school breakfast programs. One of the big challenges is poverty. When I was working in Arizona, it was with the Gila River Indian community, and that population has the highest rate of type 2 diabetes in the world. It's actually half the people over age 30 have type 2 diabetes in that community. It's just really devastated by type 2 diabetes. And I was doing a site visit at one of the schools, trying to focus on health promotion, disease prevention. And because of poverty, the majority of kids depended on the schools for breakfast and lunch. And the most popular breakfast item was the giant cinnamon rolls with the white caked on sugar. And kids would eat 2 or 3 at a time because they're hungry. And this is not rocket science. We're basically throwing fuel onto a fire and not investing in healthier foods in the first place. And I have seen some communities do a better job at investing in healthier school-based foods. But you have to have champions from the community. You can't just plop a salad bar in with spinach and expect that that's going to have a big impact. You have to have champions within the community to advocate for local health food system improvement. And I've seen a lot of local improvements in commodity food programs. And a little bit I can show you the picture of some of the older commodity foods, but we are seeing improvements made, which I think is meaningful, and we still need to move in that direction. And whether or not someone is using WIC, we need to do more to promote breastfeeding. And when I was working, I've worked with a number of tribes over the years, and on one hand, we're trying to promote breastfeeding from a health policy perspective, but then even our local employers in the community would not facilitate it. You know, you wouldn't be able to even bring a baby into work. We should be promoting that, right, as long as possible, to promote breastfeeding in the workplace even, and have safe places and privacy and really promote it. So quite often our health policies are not aligned with our social policies or even our workforce policies. We need to be smarter about that, and that's an area where we can make some meaningful improvements. And then just looking at early childhood nutrition generally, I went back home, unfortunately, for a funeral just a couple of months ago in Kyle. And you probably see this in Manderson as well, or probably in your home communities and for many of you. I go home and all of the kids, even the 5-6-year-old kids, are drinking sodas and eating those spicy Cheetos. You know, that seems to be like the most popular food now. But I wonder what's happening to them even from an epigenetic perspective. You know, the stress on the body can even change our DNA. And these little bodies are still growing. Their organ systems are still developing. Neurologically, they're still developing. What's happening when we pour sugar, chemicals, and whatever a Cheeto is, I don't know, you know, with all the spice on it, what's happening to their development? You know, what are the long-term implications in health? And it's just rampant when I see that. So I think we have to really take a much stronger look at early childhood nutrition and how is that going to have an impact over time. And then, of course, access to traditional foods is very important. The traditional foods are just wonderful. They're delicious. They're healthy. But not every community has access to that. So one of the things I saw in Arizona, they even had local farmers markets and local growing of food, even if it wasn't traditional to that population. And I remember there was one farmer, local gardener basically, who was also growing persimmon. I don't know if you've ever had persimmon, but it's incredibly tasty. It looks like a tomato, but it's actually sweet. And the kids absolutely loved it. And I said, you know, I wonder how many indigenous kids or kids in general just have never tasted that. So even though it wasn't indigenous, it was locally cultivated and kids liked it. And I'd much rather see them eating that than the bag of whatever chip that they're eating anyway. So there's a number of types of solutions that we could consider, just the locally cultivated foods. What's happening in Navajo Nation, they're taxing junk food. We haven't had enough data to see how successful that is. There's ethical arguments against it too. You know, you're taxing people who are already impoverished and they may not have enough access to healthier choices. So one of the things I've seen with the tribal community in Minnesota is that they're subsidizing water. So if someone goes to the vending machine, the soda's $1.25, but the water's 25 cents. You know, I think that's a smart choice. And they're having more protein-based snacks in the vending machine instead of just carbohydrate and fat-based choices. Then those are cheaper. And they're finding the kids are choosing them because they cost less. So we can do more creative things like making the healthier choices the less expensive option.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. I have to put, you know, a plug in, so to speak, for those people who can work in policy, because I haven't very much, but I recognize how crucial that is. I worked actually at the School of Medicine and Health Sciences at UND as well, and one of the things we worked on was a healthy campus, and it was a big deal to make it a tobacco-free campus at that time. And, you know, lots of debates and careful meetings and everything, but basically if you make a policy that smoking is not allowed on campus, you're going to have a lot of students probably cutting down or quitting. You know, when you jump the tobacco tax such that it goes from $3 a pack to $5 a pack, a bunch of people are going to quit smoking. And, you know, if vending soda machines are just not allowed in schools in North Dakota, period, if that were a law, you're going to have the glycemic index of a lot of kids dropping, you know. So I really am a big advocate of people who can work in policy, and, you know, it's a lot of desk work, but I really believe in that, which kind of leads me to my other segue here as far as, I imagine, you know, I was thinking of who's going to be here, and I imagine a lot of people who are in here are going to be interested in at least advocating or helping, or like, okay, well, what can we all do to make this better, you know? And one discussion that is on the table amongst Indian communities and people working on Indian health are how can we have good allies? So if you are not a member of a tribal community, but you want you want to help, you want to contribute, what can you do? And I guess one way, being the psychology hat now a little bit, is that I think it's important to first take a step and say, how am I approaching this? Because I think it's fair to say that we, as tribal people, we're not necessarily looking for pity. Some of the statistics are pretty stark, to put it one way. They're pretty, dramatically negative often. And the history is really tragic, but we're not looking for pity. So I guess one of my favorite quotes, I'll use this, one of my favorite quotes from an Aboriginal lady. She goes, if you have come here to help us, then you're wasting your time. But if you have come here because your future is entwined with my future, then let's work together. And I really love that because it changes the dynamic. And the fact of the matter is that I don't think we're pitiful at all. I was just, actually I'll kind of share a story here because it's powerful and fitting. I was in a hospital room with one of my uncles who was dying here recently in Bismarck. And it was, obviously, there's death and dying and mourning, but we were elbow to elbow in the room. As far as the point I'm making today is, we were elbow to elbow for the whole 2 days that he was in there before he passed. And when we brought him out, I think I counted there was 18 of us. It was a large procession. And they were poor. They were dirt poor. But they were not poor, if that makes sense. So when we'd go in to visit, a lot of the other rooms were just empty, And a lot of those people might have had a lot more money than my uncle's family. But the family is still really rich in so many ways. And that's just one example that came to mind, and it's real. I'm being honest here. Another example that I like to think of is, because one of the modern things is intermittent fasting, right? And there's all this research coming out on how healthy fasting is for you. Well, we've been doing that for a long time as part of our ceremonies, but knowing that cleanses. And so there are a lot of things we can all learn from each other. And I think that if allies come into that with that mindset rather than one of these pitiful Indians, we'll go a lot farther, if that makes sense. So obviously there are direct ways that folks can be good allies as far as policy, as far as donating to funds, donating to tribal colleges, support your tribal farmers markets. There are kind of direct ways to help and support, but I think even in more indirect ways, wherever you feel like you are drawn to show your support. For example, there's right now a movement in the Department of Education to reflect what's happening in Montana. They have Indian Education for All. Is anyone familiar with that a little bit? So Montana has gone through many steps to pass law that says all Montana schools will include tribal history and education in their schools because it is a huge part of the history of Montana. And everyone should have that. And the absence of it is not accurate. And so there's a lot to it, but that process is also happening in North Dakota, and I believe, they're called essential understandings, but that is happening. And my point is that even by lending, even if you just bring that up in a conversation, and say, hey, wow, that's happening. You know what, I think that'd be really great for even our non-Native students. By empowering and providing support to that kind of movement, in turn, it strengthens the, ideally, it would really empower Native students. It just helps us to reclaim our, what's the word I'm looking for? I guess reclaim our freedom to go ahead and pursue ways of getting better. which in turn means, hey, yeah, let's have a buffalo program. Yeah, let's develop this new initiative in our reservation. So there are direct ways that you can help, and there are also maybe less direct ways that you can help. But we sure appreciate allies, if that makes sense.
Thank you. This discussion is so rich. I'm learning a lot and reflecting upon a lot, but I think there's one more thing that could make the situation even more rich, and that is to hear from you in the audience if you have questions. We have a microphone that is available, and so if you have a question or comment that you'd like to bring before our panelists, now's the time.
I don't know if it's a question or more of a comment. I'm Mara Ibora. I'm a registered dietitian for the land grant department at UTTC. This is our team of land grant, so I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for everything you said. Dr. Warren, actually, you inspired me with that story at the first annual Native American conference about the three sisters, and I'm applying for MPH program this fall. So, and specifically with a focus on Native American health. So thank you for that. With our department at Land Grant, we do a lot of work in the food systems with growing our food, and these three right here worked all summer, and we produce so much fresh produce. And then with being a dietitian, being a dietitian, kind of doing the end part of the food system, and I also get an awesome opportunity to work with Karen on local food as a part of the Bismarck Farmers Market, and then I actually do work with the food distribution program on Indian reservations. I'm the consulting dietitian for the Mountain Plains region to provide nutrition education. I'm really humbled for the opportunity to go to tribal communities and talk with them about nutrition education and on how to do more nutrition education with the FDPIR and on the food package review group. So I would love to talk more about wild rice because the face-to-face meeting is next month, and that is a hot topic that we are talking about, to learn more about that. But mostly from my perspective, or what I'm really wanting to know, and maybe even my team here, is how do you stay grounded in the work you do, not get frustrated, especially when we know this is such important work. How do you get people interested and want to care about it, with also, and from my perspective, without being an intervention or a program that is set, where it could be an organic, conversation, without, I am USD, we are all USDA funded, so we do have to do reports and numbers, but how can we do this work in an intentional, purposeful way that is grounded without being an intervention or a program that is grant funded, and not get frustrated about if people are interested or not showing up to our cooking classes and things like that. But I could probably keep going and keep asking questions and picking brains, but maybe that's for another time, but interested in that specifically.
Yeah, I'd say it's very easy to get frustrated because for many of us, we can see a path forward that's a healthier choice, but we don't always have our communities going in those paths. And what I've realized over the years is we have so much unresolved trauma that we're not going to actually get to those solutions that we can visualize until we address the trauma. So that's a big part of my work now, is to look at trying to address historical trauma, but also preventing adverse childhood experiences. And it's also in the paper that we wrote, focused on social determinants of American Indian nutritional health, is that what I see is a lot of self-medication, whether it's alcohol or substance, but I also see a lot of people using food for self-medication, quite honestly. And we have a lot of undiagnosed and unaddressed, unresolved trauma. And that's, for me, the upstream approach. The way upstream is looking at the historical trauma, adverse childhood experiences, impact of boarding schools. So for me, that's the space where I'm working now, is trying to work upstream. And then also with our programs now at UND, we have the Indigenous Health MPH specialization, and we also now have a PhD in Indigenous Health that we'll be offering starting next fall. So it'll be the first of its kind doctorate in Indigenous Health, recognizing that we have a lot of common challenges among indigenous populations that have been colonized. So impacts on food systems, but so many other arenas as well. So it's almost impossible not to feel frustration in the work, but I think identifying the victories along the way and celebrating those, and having teams of people like what you're doing, and having really cultivating champions from within the communities. And that's what I've also seen. We could have the best of intentions with a program that is evidence-based, worked very well in Atlanta, therefore we're going to plop it down in Newtown and expect that it will work. But I think that's a big part of it, and you're doing it the right way by integrating with community. The interventions have to be community-driven interventions, and whatever we can do to support that is vitally important. And I've kind of, just for me, come to the realization, that, and it is a traditional perspective, we're taught to pray for 7 generations ahead. And I take a lot of strength in knowing that 7 generations ago, they were praying for me. They were praying for all of us. And I don't think that in my lifetime, we're going to resolve all the problems. I really don't. But that's okay, because we're laying the foundation and the groundwork for the next 7 generations. Maybe in the time of my children's grandchildren, we're going to see real improvements, and our health can be back to the way it was at one point in terms of living in a more healthy way and being better connected across populations. And that's what I'm working toward. I may not see it in this form as a human person, but that's my goal, is that in the future, my future generations will see those improvements. But we have to work now to build that foundation.
Yeah, definitely got me all reflecting about 7 generations now, but I definitely agree. Also, just to agree with the champions, and I think we're all champions in some way. In our work, when I was at the college, and at where I am now in our segment, I was encouraged, and I guess took some initiative in just going with what you're really passionate about. So each and every one of you probably have a specific passion, maybe some of your students. And I know from working for your USDA grants that they're pretty flexible. So there was no horse therapy program when I stepped in at NHSC, but I said, I think this is going to be great for our people. I see the interest. I'm excited about it. Hey, can we alter our grant goals to include this? And they said, yeah, you bet, absolutely, And then therefore I could bring the energy to it every day. And everyone might have their own different passion, but I think, like he said, it's that champion. And I do believe that passion and spirit, kind of go hand in hand. So if there are sparks like that, and I would just encourage everybody to don't try to just kind of go with the program that you've been presented or that's on paper, but if there's a passion or a spark within your department or your students, just really go with that. And I think you'll be supported in a lot of ways. Have to put in one just neat thing that I saw recently from Zach, what is his last name? Zachary Page. He works with the Indigenous Seed Keepers in Minnesota. They're just a really cool group, and he started this program, the Hello Fresh, the prepackaged foods that are being delivered now. He's starting that with indigenous foods. I'm like, well, that's genius, because when people are at that stage of readiness to start thinking about, maybe I might want to try some of our traditional foods, but I don't know how to prepare it, and what do I cook it with? So that was a neat thing that is happening in Minnesota, and just wanted to acknowledge that and put it out there. Another thing that I found just in our work in Twin Buttes is that we have we have a Twin Buttes community website, Facebook page, and that even just promoting, if it's a little steps that you're taking, but just the more you get the pictures out there, your community gets to see it, the imagery and the beautiful colors of the vegetables. And I just believe that repetition, the more people see what you're doing, eventually they're gonna grow to be more excited and just build it into their lines of thinking as well. So just some specifics to add in there.
Anybody want to see more pictures? Just real quick, okay.
Two more pictures. Anyone else have a question or a comment that they'd like to share?
Well, I'll just show, fry bread. Now, it's really been acculturated into what we do, and of course, its roots are in the commodity food program, but every time I go to a powwow, a ceremony, a gathering, it's just expectation it will be there. We've got to work on that. Really, that's on us to change this perspective for the next generation, that's not traditional food. And, on the right, you can see the elder using commodity shortening and commodity flour to make fry bread, and now we call it traditional. But it honestly is poison, and it's for our next generation. We've really got to address this. So here's a picture of some commodity foods, things that I grew up with. I hear people laughing because you probably remember eating this stuff, right? And we'll put beef and pork in quotations. I'm not exactly sure what that was. And of course, commodity cheese. I hate to admit it, but I like commodity cheese. I wish I didn't, but I do. But on the right, that's one of the big jars of pure corn syrup. And you can see it says use in your baby formula, use as a syrup for your pancakes.
Yeah, well, we'd put it on top of the fry bread.
Yeah, I put it on fry bread, So corn syrup, and of course I'm not trained as a nutritionist, but it's basically poison. It's not natural or healthy. It's really such a change to a beautiful food, corn. We had hundreds of varieties of corn, and there were some red corns and purple corns that actually have more starch, or less starch and more fiber, and they actually can lower blood sugar if you have the right type of blending of red and purple corns. So there's entire families known as red corns, for example. But now we just have the yellow sweet corn that we think of, and that's used in our food to create corn syrup that's put into just about everything. But it says right there, use in baby formula. So just remarkable. So we're trying to fix this and looking at ways to address this in a more meaningful way. So I had mentioned we'll be starting our PhD in Indigenous Health, and we're offering now a Master of Public Health in Indigenous Health. And I'm just so proud of our team that we've been able to assemble. We have a lot of Indigenous scholars now at University of North Dakota just since the last year. In addition to myself, I have Dr. Siobhan Westcott. She has her MD from Harvard, MPH from UCLA. She's Athabascan from Alaska. Does a lot of work with adverse childhood experiences, but also she's worked with fetal alcohol syndrome earlier in her training. Dr. Melanie Nadu, who is from Turtle Mountain, she's Ojibwe, has both PhD and MPH from University of Minnesota, focused on social and behavioral epidemiology. Nicole Redvers is Dene from Northern Territories in Canada. She's a naturopathic physician and is finishing her MPH from Dartmouth right now. And we just hired Ursula Running Bear. She's Shichangu Lakota, which is from Rosebud. And for the last 17 years, she's been on faculty at University of Colorado, and she's joining us in 2 weeks. So I'm just so pleased with the team that we've been able to assemble, and I'm very excited about the future. And this all fits into the broader discussion of Indigenous health, both from a bioethical perspective and a policy perspective, as well as nutritional perspective and thinking about food systems and how those have evolved over time. So again, trying to focus on solutions and moving forward, and the groundwork that we provide today hopefully will have an impact on the future generation. So I wanted to provide I like pictures, so I'll show those. All right.
Question?
I don't have a question, but I don't know if everyone here has seen your photos of how medicine used to be viewed, and then it went to different medicine, then we're back at kind of Back to the Future. That's another one that I think that's good focus for nutrition and how we look at food as healing. So, and what we've been doing for Prevent Child Abuse in North Dakota, and actually used to work with Dr. Warren at NDSU, where we have our evaluation team, is we started with a self-healing community model that we worked in Spirit Lake Nation, Turtle Mountain Band, and Chippewa Indians, addressing adverse childhood experiences and the community healing itself with the understanding of not only ACEs, historical trauma, but specifically resiliency. And it has now moved into a different grant where we're looking at nutrition, Indigenous breastfeeding, because the community's leading it. They're creating their own solutions because they already know what the solutions are, and we just stay out of the way and they create it. So there is some movement towards traditional foods because now there's been community connections and community discussions about the history and trauma and how they're healing it. And now there's a lot of empowerment going on up in Turtle Mountain in that area, and there's a lot of nutrition discussion. So it's kind of been fun to watch, but also aligns with what you're talking about, meeting the basic needs and then moving into that next area. And I often think about gardening as another way to connect as a community, what our initial ideas, which didn't come to fruition, but what we're hoping to, is creating community gardens within each housing district. So there's discussion on the gardening, but creating the food together, cooking together, and then creating those community connections with the children and the families so people are outside and enjoying each other's company. And so it's just some of the initial work that Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians is doing right now. And it kind of started out of home visiting out of NDSC with their evaluation.
Yeah, you say growing communities while you're growing food, it's kind of the motto that the NHSC is using in the gardens as well. Is when people come together, they're growing the food, but we're also side by side and coming together for something good. And yeah.
I'll also say just the cultural differences and cultural perspectives, like even breastfeeding. We breastfed a lot longer than just 6 months, like is the minimum recommendation, sometimes for 2 to 3 years. And again, it's different cultural perspectives, so people might have different feelings about it or thoughts about it or perspectives on it. But in the traditional way, one generation was responsible for the entire next generation. So I'm just as responsible for my nephew as I am for my son. And this whole idea of a nuclear family is kind of a colonized perspective. It was imposed on us. It's not who we are. And what about the word nuclear family? That doesn't sound very appealing to me anyway, a nuclear family. So you would even have aunts that would breastfeed for nieces and nephews, that this is normal human behavior, but there's stigma attached to that, based on a colonized cultural perspective, and that's something imposed on us. But again, having a whole generation responsible for the next generation, I think is a healthier approach, actually, than looking at just one family at a time, the nuclear family. And if you have one family member that is having struggles, then you're really concentrating those outcomes on those children. And I think that you need to have from a ethical perspective and a cultural perspective, and from a perspective of promoting health, I think the old way is better than the new way.
Well, again, I would like to thank all of you and each of you for making time to be here today to hear from these people who have dedicated their lives to creating connections. I'm honored to be helping bring their voices forward. And I'd just like everyone to, as you leave this room, to make sure that what you heard and learned today doesn't stop at the doors when you walk out, but that you take an idea, that you take an encouragement that was shared, to go back and tell someone else, to do further research and look up something more to encourage and continue your own learning, and to continue to move forward together. So thank you to our audience. Thank you especially to Dr. Warren, to Dr. Whiteplume, and for the Northern Plains Ethics Institute for bringing us together today.
I have something a little bit to say, I guess. I was trying to get the mic earlier, so she was looking. I'm Robert Fox. I work at United Tribes Technical College, and also I have the, I don't know if it's privilege or not, I went to a tribal school, I went to a public school, and I graduated from a boarding school, which is pretty rare nowadays. And my kids now have went to school their whole lives here in Bismarck. But when you're talking about the education thing, I'm learning a lot from them too, because they go here, and a lot of times they were telling me in class, when they would happen to talk about Native stuff, sometimes the teacher would be like, they would say something, then they would kind of look right at her or my son and go, is that right? You know, are we talking right? And a lot of times they would say, yeah, that's right, but we're not the teachers. Why is everybody looking at us like? So they really do need to include the real Native, stuff about the culture or different things in the schools. And I also coach, like at the Legacy, the high school here, I'm one of the assistant coaches with football, now with track. But a lot of the coaches that they happen to teach in these schools, and they're asking me, because I talk to them, they're like, we have this Native girl and our guy that's in our class, and we're trying to talk to them, or how do we, so I'm explaining the cultural to them, they're like, oh, we never knew that. So it's just simple cultural stuff. And the other thing we help with our gardens is my kids, since they've been going here all the time, they have a lot of kids, a lot of their friends are non-Native. I've brought them out to the gardens after, like they'd come visit, and I'd say, well, let's go out, we go pick something up, go out to the gardens. And they're amazed, they're like, what? We didn't know corn came in different colors and different shapes, and this is native corn, and all that stuff. So they're learning a lot through that. But yeah, it would be nice if the state did start including some of that more into the actual schools, because now that I've been working in the Bismarck school system, are kind of, getting involved with it more. The teachers and everybody are asking me, hey, what about this and what about this? You guys do gardens too, and it's pretty, but yeah, they need some more of that stuff, laws and whatever passed, and policies. Thank you, I just wanted to explain it.
Yeah, and I agree, we need more truth about history and understanding of the indigenous peoples to this area. And South Dakota's moved in this direction as well, providing that in the public schools, but I'd love to see more of that in North Dakota. I don't know if you have anything.
Yeah, just good to see you again. There was actually a small seed exchange happening between tribes and NHSC, I think, started. So, yeah, we're just really happy and proud of everything. Your gardens, I've seen his gardens, their gardens, they're incredible. It's actually a small space, but just like really blooming. And so, yeah, good to see you all here and good to hear from you, definitely.